Now I want you to think about this question, and if it was a face-to-face class, we'd actually have this discussion, but in this case, we're just going to have you kind of write it down or something. What factors shape what a culture is like? Why is it that, for example, among the Tlingit traditionally, you had very large coastal villages with plank houses, and with this extensive moiety system and what's called the Kwan system, as well as the clan system, which we'll talk about later in the semester. Why did you have that there? Why did you have language differences, though, between that group and some of the next groups over, such as the Haida, such as the Tsimshian? Why is it that you have the Gwich'in, where caribou are so fundamentally central, traditionally prior to colonialism, to so many things, to the point where people even today still say, we are caribou people, right? Traditionally, caribou were part of so many different aspects of Gwich'in life. But then you have other cultures where where caribou's not really terribly important to their culture. How does that come to be? How do those differences come to be? Why do cultures have such diversity within the state of Alaska, as well as anywhere? And as I talk about students with that, we usually come upon several different factors. One of the most obvious is environment, right? If you want to understand why cultures are the way they are, a big factor is environment. For Inupiat culture, traditionally, fur clothing, igloos during the winter time, smaller sort of residential arrangements, all of these things were logical and sensible adaptations to a tundra environment, where protein was something that you often obtained from the sea, where temperatures were often extremely cold. Of course, we want to avoid being what's called environmental determinists. What that means, in essence, is thinking that environment shapes everything, because it really, really, really doesn't, right? If environment shaped everything, why can you have two groups next to each other, such as Dena'ina and Shukpiaq or Alutiiq, who speak such different languages and have such different, traditionally, had such different religious practices? So, environment is not by any stretch of the imagination everything, but it is something, right? It certainly influences some things, and especially we tend to see that in terms of the homes people live in, the kinds of clothing they wear, what was available. Individuals, right, come up with ideas that transform societies, and as a result of that, that can, over several generations, if that individual's ideas were popular enough, become a transformative effect on people's lives. Traditions, right? People's sacred teachings that they've passed down that influence how they act and how they behave. The effects of other groups, right? So you will see, for example, Shukpiaq and Yupik kinds of words pop up occasionally in Dena'ina, which shouldn't shock us since they're sort of next door neighbors in certain parts of the territory. So groups have kind of blending together, and also resist each other's influence to some degree, and sometimes want to draw distinctions between each other and say, no, we're our own thing. So all these things influence culture, among other things. Well, having said that, and having said that we shouldn't be environmental determinists, I am now going to make a bit of a claim for how powerful the environment can be on culture, by specifically talking about the land of Alaska from sort of an environmental perspective and how that shapes the diversity of our state, because our state is incredibly culturally diverse. As we'll talk about, there are 8 different major cultural groupings. There are 20 different languages. That's very, very diverse. So where does that come from? Comes from a lot of different places, but at least a bit of where it comes from is our environment, which is incredibly varied. So I like to ask students, when you think of Alaska, what do you think of? And oftentimes get all sorts of answers, but they oftentimes have to do with the environmental features of Alaska. So let's talk about those. In Alaska, there are 39 mountain ranges. That is incredible. That is different than pretty much any comparable piece of land that I can think of in the United States, and that matters from a cultural perspective because sometimes mountain ranges act as natural barriers between groups of people that would lead them to branch off in different cultural ways. Other times that's not the case, such as for parts of Dena'ina territory where you have mountains but you have people crossing over that, particularly on Outer Inlet. 3 million lakes and 3 majorly different types of ecoregions, and what I mean by that is that we have taiga, we have tundra, with boreal. So we have two very different kinds of forests, and then we have, taiga/boreal, and then we have coastal rainforest. And so those 3 very different kinds of things, right? Taiga with its really thin tree kind of settings, coastal rainforest, humid forests, huge trees, and then tundra. it's Alaska's kind of a collision zone between these three different things. So we would expect groups in the coastal southeast to be really different to some degree from groups in the far north. That just makes sense, right? Totally different resources available, totally different conditions you have to adapt to. And that partly reflects the fact that Alaska's just huge, right? We've all heard that silly joke about the Alaska senator and the Texas senator, and they're in an argument, and the Alaska senator says, hey, you better be careful. If you keep this up, I might cut Alaska in two and make Texas the third biggest state, right? Alaska's just gigantic. It's 1/5 of the size of the continental contiguous lower 48. And across that space, things are patchy, by which I mean there's some areas where the resources are incredibly sparse. And then areas where they're incredibly abundant. Just think of the salmon runs on the Kenai Peninsula. And that affects cultural diversity as well, because cultures oftentimes try to control areas where you have really good resource abundance. And so you're going to have people finding the different places, finding the coastal areas, finding the river areas, finding places, finding the good caribou run, and kind of setting up shop there, whether that's a permanent village or, as was often the case, a semi-migratory pattern where you were sometimes in that area and sometimes in another area, but people often set up shop in those areas where the resources are really plentiful. And so as a result, that then often becomes kind of its own group that's kind of setting up right there. All of this kind of has to do with what's called a cultural ecology model. It's something you'll learn about if you go forward in anthropology. You don't really need to know it, so we'll just keep rolling right along. My point here, though, is environment is a major variable in how cultures adapt.